uh, Heskahal Tepessier, Julie Jeffers, Louise Quest. My name is Julie Jeffers. I am the Indian Education for All Specialist with OPI. I am new this year. I started back in June, graduated with my Tribal Historic Preservation degree from SKC on June 8th, started with OPI on June 10th. Um, it was absolutely wonderful, the dream job. I worked with Billings Public Schools for 10 years in Indian Education for All as a home to school coordinator, working mainly with students. And now I get to work with teachers, and I absolutely love what I'm doing. I am one of two Indian Education for All specialists. So we have Mike Jetty is the other one, and he's in here today. Jennifer Statham has tomorrow is her last day. She is heading out to Idaho as the new Indian Education for All director. So we will still be in contact, but she's going to be actually closer to me, but farther away from the rest of us. So I live on the Flathead Reservation and grew up in Billings, Montana. And today, this is my first webinar series that I am hosting. We were sitting in a meeting and Thunderous came up. Everybody was talking about how it was such a good book. Somebody mentioned April Wills, somebody mentioned Mandy Broaddus, and I said, well, why don't we do a book study on it? And this was the third day of my job, and they said, well, why don't you take that over? So bear with me. I hope everything goes smoothly. I'm going to ask that everybody kind of signs into the chat and tells us what school they're from. It would be great to know who's all there. Joan has put in the Google Doc to sign in also. So you get your credits for this class. I hope that everybody will also be joining us next week and the third week. If things go smoothly, we would like to invite our three presenters back for best practices in the spring and do more of a roundtable type setting if things go good and we get the feedback that we'd like. We'd like to have some conversations about books and how to grab a book and just make a lesson plan from it. So I'm going to turn this over to our presenter today. Our presenter is April Wills. April is currently teaching fourth grade in Culbertson and has been teaching in Montana for the past 11 years. She is a historical teacher leader for the Montana Historical Society, a previous Centennial Bell Award winner, which is really awesome. If you look her up, there's a really good article and her ringing the bell in Helena with her students. And currently Montana History Teacher of the Year for the Gilder Lehrman Institute. She has presented across the state and is currently developing lesson plans under a grant from the Foundation of Montana History with rural museums in an effort to bring place-based history into the classrooms. I'm turning it over to you, April, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is super exciting. I don't know, Zoom is, I'm just going to be upfront, is not my preferred method of collaborating with teachers across the state, but it's kind of exciting because it brings us all together. So we're kind of just going to jump in. If you have a copy of Thunderous, I encourage you kind of just have it beside you. We're going to refer to it. And I'm just going to kind of lay out how I came to develop lesson plans for this book, activities I've tied to it and used within my own classroom. And then hopefully at the end, you'll feel inspired and creative and willing to share out some thoughts that you have come up with after sitting through this. So I'll hop in and I might have a lagging slide change. Just a tiny bit about me. I do have two sons. I have taught them both, so that's exciting. I taught my youngest son last year in fifth grade. I've taught a range of grades from second all the way to seventh. I have my master's in learning and technology, and I just love working with teachers across the state and soon to be the nation, which is interesting to think about. All these developments are happening. I do have to throw in a little plug for the Montana Historical Society. I am a teacher leader for them. And as a teacher, if you're looking for, ways to tie Montana history into your classroom and curriculum, there's a lot of us across the state, which is exciting. We're expanding and kind of exploding as a group. So you could reach out through the website and contact somebody in your area, or you can always feel free to reach out to me too. So I kind of wanted to just start off with the intention behind the lesson and what I developed. It came from finding the book through another historical leader and was suggested to me as a great way to kind of launch my 7th grade English class and get a feel for where they are with Montana history and what they know about different tribes across the nation. And it turned into a really beautiful lesson that I feel like can be used across all sorts of grades. The intention with the lesson is to build connections with your students while allowing them to build connections with their peers, to grow empathy within your classroom, your building, and your community, and then foster an understanding of what makes us as Montanans similar and all the differences that we have too, and then just kind of celebrate those. I really like to think about families, especially at the beginning of the school year with all of the grades I teach. I think that when you look at the dynamics of different groups, it brings a whole new level of what to expect from your students, what to expect from your community, and then how you can start to make ties to their cultures. And so when we're discussing things with your class, I want you to kind of keep that in the forefront of your mind. I have a piece of data in here, and it is from Mandy Smoker. She had done a Montana, I believe it was a Montana Library interview. And she had said that 1.5% to 2% of literature is native based. And some of that, maybe most of it, I shouldn't quote this inaccurately, but is produced by non-native writers. So the nice thing about this piece of literature that you can bring into any one of your grades is that this is going to be produced by a native author. And it's illustrated also by Dale DeForest. So you're getting artwork that is exciting to bring into your classroom. You're getting a nice storyline, and you can know that it's pretty sound and developed over the course of the cultural aspect of the tribe. So it's really exciting. One thing that I also enjoy about this is that it's a contemporary piece. I think that's really good for our students to pull them into what's happening currently within different tribes. And it allows you to make lots of spider webs to what else could be happening. You can pull in newspaper articles. You can pull in other pieces of literature. You can do lots of comparing and contrasting. And I really like that the main character is a female lead. So that's also something exciting. I also start to talk really fast. So if I'm talking really fast, somebody tell me to slow down. I don't have access to the chat box, but I thought it'd be kind of interesting for you to kind of type up some things about how you foster relationships in your classroom, just so I can kind of get a feel for things that you might already be doing. And then I'll need somebody on the other side to share those.
We can do that for you, April.
Thank you.
Mike says food and bad dad jokes, which is pretty much it.
I expect that out of Mike.
Lori says circle time.
Mm.
Lori is a school counselor, so that's nice.
Oh, yeah.
Journaling, sharing if they want to, from Caitlin Greenwood. Christopher Howard, who is at West High in Billings, finding a common item of discussion during the project. Sorry, finding a common item of discussion during the project.
Maybe just get one or two more in there.
I invite community members and family members into my classroom. And that's from Amy Williams at Polson.
Perfect. I think those are all excellent ways to foster those relationships. Making things connectable for students, bringing in their family members is a wonderful option or idea. I like Mike's jokes. He always opens up with a joke, so I'm not disappointed by that response. I love hearing his jokes. Outside of novels and stories with fostering relationships in my classroom, I rely a lot on music and just different games. And so you'll see some of that in the lesson plan. And so as we're starting to begin, I want you to be thinking, how can I use what I'm already doing to create an activity that could tie into either this book or any book? Because really it's about creating lessons for anything. Like I'm constantly creating lessons. I attend the history conference and a lot of my peers are like, why are you on your Chromebook this whole time? And it's because I have so many ideas coming into my mind about how to use actual historian-based products and turn them into lessons. So it's kind of exciting. So I'd encourage everybody to do the same thing. Okay, so thinking about where to start, there's no better place than with the author. This is a co-authored book. So we have Mandy Smoker, and these are just some tidbits about her. I'm not going to read them all to you because hopefully you can read my slide just fine. But when I was researching her and listening to a vast amount of informational products that were put out about the book and interviews that she had done, she is amazing. Like she has this massive list of accolades and accomplishments. And so I was very excited to start diving into her book and creating lessons based off of something that she had co-authored. The other gal who wrote the book is Natalie Petersey. And listening to them talk within interviews is really exciting. You can kind of start to understand how they were able to develop this book, and you get to see their relationship and some of the things that they use to bounce ideas off of each other and then develop it. So just a little bit about her. I do share this with my students. I think it's important for them to understand and see the diversity of background information and knowledge that an author can bring into a book, and then see how all of these accolades come up in a person's life and like how they get there. So we have conversations based around those things, and it kind of opens their eyes too to the possibilities of things that can come down the road for them. So it's kind of exciting. I like to lead then into understanding the importance of place. So Mandy Smoker talked about Heartbeat. I do have a QR code, and I'm just going to check it. It should work, at least from your screen. It worked from mine earlier. And it will take you to a poem about Heartbeat. Which is on Daily Poetry, and it's from Mandy Smoker. And I felt it was important for my students to get the background knowledge of how place plays such a vital role in lots of people's lives, but especially tribal affiliated lives, and how place influences tradition and culture. And so we started off with this poem about Heartbeat, which she had referenced in her interview. And I'm hoping that next week, she'll kind of talk on this too, because the poem is beautiful. And I think you get such strong emotion evoked out of it that you can start to understand her writing in a more formal way. So this is the poem. I'm also not going to read it, but I'm going to give you like 1 minute to read it, and then we'll talk about it. So as you're finishing up, we're going to rely on the chat a lot just because I don't know what the viewers are able to do, if they can talk or not. And if they can, that's great. We can totally have a conversation. But I should preface, I did this with my 7th grade English course. I know I mentioned that previously, but I think you could bring this poem all the way down into a 5th grade classroom. And I think that it has a lot of potential for great conversation, and then allowing students to get a lot of great vocabulary words and understand, the whole entire intention of writing something and being specific with your chosen words and then author style. So in the chat, if you can pull some things out that stand out to you, and then we can share those out.
And we can do an open discussion too if you'd like, April. That's
Okay.
we haven't muted anybody. So if people want to talk, they can, or ask a question.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I'm a people person.
It's easier.
I can't see anybody but you, so I'm like, I don't even know what I look like. It's kind of it's weird.
Okay, this is Trisha. I'm in Kalispell. And I'm having trouble getting my chat out of the way, so now I can't remember all the verbs, but I was saying that I really like how active a lot of the verbs are. Jutting is one that stood out to me.
Yeah, because when I first read this, Trisha, I was thinking, oh my gosh, how many times have I used any of these words? It's a really good vocab lesson, but then a grammar lesson too.
Yeah, and some of the things that are really active are not things that we think of as being active. So also taking things out of the boxes we put them in.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good thought. Thanks for sharing.
I didn't quite hear the prompt of what we're responding to, but I think it's just kind of like the connectors that are within the poem and our views and thoughts of it. Was that correct?
Yeah, that'll work. I was just thinking what stands out to you and what could stick with you from the poem.
Okay. I think that very first line with the unsympathetic wind, especially if you live in an area where we are cold and we've got lots of wind, and those images and those feelings that can kind of really bring you into an experience that you've had, where who's ever had their fingertips cold, who's ever had their face blown by the wind off the lake or whatever, but really bringing yourself into that and visualizing and connecting right away with it.
Yeah, and I live in Eastern Montana, so I can totally understand an unsympathetic wind. It's very cold over here all the time. I was even thinking as I had finished saying, the prompt, I could take this, and I haven't done this yet, but this is my teacher brain. It always is on. I could take this sentence by sentence and have my kids, pull out words that maybe they don't know, words that stand out to them, and then analyzing it sentence by sentence so that it's a little bit easier, especially at the 5th grade level.
So in the chat, KP also said it's very descriptive. And I definitely agree with that because it kind of makes you sit back and close your eyes and go, wow, you can see everything she's saying. I liked the part where it says vegetation or cause the rock and soil and vegetation to congregate. And yeah, again, that's a word that you wouldn't commonly use as a descriptor for those elements.
Yeah.
So
One of my favorite is the tiny syncopated chorus calling everyone home. Like that just fills my soul. I don't know. I just love it. I love the whole poem. So before I move on, I'll see if anybody else wants to share.
Christopher, were you saying something?
yeah, I was, I teach art over at West High here in Billings, and just by looking at some of the words, even reading this at the high school level and just picking out things like syncopated. So I even had to look it up just so I could have like a better idea of what it was, since I don't teach music. And just having to read this, present this or have students read it or myself read it, and then just pick out some of the more complicated words that, you're kind of putting them together in kind of a way that you have to think about what's going on here. This is a word that's in music, but yet we have mountains and we're talking about this environment. And then maybe have my students think about how you'd represent that pictorially, like drawing it out using color. Do you feel cold? Do you feel hot? Just so, yeah. And so that's one way I would probably use this information even at the high school, because that's probably something I would use. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. I think that's great. I'm so excited that we have a variety of different teachers in here. We have art teachers and counselors. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of keep going. I'm sure some people are like, well, why are we like, this isn't the book Thunderous. But I think if you've looked at Thunderous, you can start to see, at least I could see this, and I don't even know if this was her intention, but I could see the beauty of poetry behind this storyline. I can hear her voice, and I really enjoy listening to Mandy speak because I feel like the voice is so strong once you kind of know actually what she sounds like. Things just really stand out to me. So I use this because I also feel like tying different genres of literature together is super important in a classroom. And like I said, this could, like, you can start in 5th grade with the poem and go all the way up to high school. I think you could take this graphic novel all the way down to 2nd grade and up to like high school. I really do, just being intentional with it. So that's the poem that I kind of led off with. Then we learned a lot about just the Lakota culture. And we started out learning about Black Elk Mountain. So Black Elk Peak is referenced in the graphic novel. What I do, because I have the flexibility to do this, is I tend to take an idea and blow it up all the way across my curriculum. So we're using maps, we're using Google, the National Park Service to gather any information we can about location, and then using that in all the learning that we're doing. So Black Elk Mountain, if you go and Google it, there's lots of beautiful images, and Google Maps is really cool because then you can zoom in. And in the front of the book, which I don't have in my slide, but in the very front of her graphic novel, if you have it beside you, if you don't, I'm going to try and show it to you, but my lighting is kind of terrible. There is, she has a pictorial image in here of the different locations that come up and how it's all surrounding Rapid City within South Dakota. And it's essentially like a map of just the places that are of importance to the storyline. So I thought we would Google all these places, we'd figure it all out. Some of my older, if I did this with older students, they would know a large majority of the places, because we are in Eastern Montana. Lots of my students do travel down to South Dakota. But last year when I taught it, I had 2 students that were from California. So it was kind of exciting to introduce them to more regional locations and things that are important to different cultures in our area. I kind of skipped ahead on a slide, which is fine. So then I did the second grade teacher thing and we made predictions based off the cover of our book and reading the blurb. I think blurbs are super important for young readers as well as older readers, because you just never know if you're going to enjoy that book or not. And the blurb gives you lots of good information. You usually figure out who your main characters are, a little bit of the plot line and your setting. And when I think about this from the perspective of a lot of other teachers that teach different content areas, you could start to sketch something out with this, or you could you could create a music playlist from the blurb. You can do a lot of things and not just predict before you even open up the cover of your book. So we make those predictions, we share them out, we talk about them, and then we save them because we want to see if our predictions are correct. I do always let them share at the end, or if they can start to make the inference that their prediction is correct, let them. We should talk about that in the middle of the book too and share it out. So just some things to talk about or think about with your class. I then wanted to talk to them about why would I bring a graphic novel into my classroom? I know there's a lot of reluctancy with graphic novels in education, but I think it's important to meet your students where they're at, and that can look like a lot of different things. So I was very excited to use graphic novels. I find that they're very motivating for a lot of students, even those reluctant readers, because there's so many images. And as a reader, you can infer a ton of things from images. And so I pull them in for those kids that are reluctant to read, but then I also pull them in because it's kind of a fun break in the day. It's not the normal literature that we're reading almost all year long. This book was highly relatable, and I also find that a lot of graphic novels are relatable. Many kids want to be able to make connections to those characters and things that are happening in their storyline as well as what's happening in their own personal life. There is a good chunk of graphic novels that have diverse ranges of vocabulary, and this one is no different. It has Lakota language in it, which is exciting. It also has a glossary so that students can understand what that language is. And all these other things that are on my slide that I'm just not going to read because we're all capable of seeing them. But I just think it's important for kids to understand that if you're reading, you're a reader. And so for me, if I have a kid who loves Thunderous, I'm probably going to find a book that might not be a graphic novel that could be similar to Thunderous's storyline in some way. And then we can start to build their reading on that. So I will talk real fast about the bottom little note here where it says graphics have been used historically throughout time to tell stories. This is a great way for me to also tie it to social studies, from pictographs to, Egyptian times and papyrus and scrolls. Images have always been around us and they always are, and we can learn a lot from them. And so I think making that connection to a graphic novel helps me as a teacher, but also helps my students think about how have we told stories over time, because it's not always been with words. Okay. Are there any questions before we move on?
Sorry, I had my phone off. So Matt Bell says it has lots of sentences with multiple clauses. It would be a good exercise. Oh, we're talking about the poem. It would be a good exercise to break them down and practice building similar dynamic sentences, which makes a lot of sense. And then Mike Jetty, on the bullet points, he says he likes your last bullet. You could bring in pictographs with that also.
Yeah. Which I think is super cool to think about. There's so many documented images even at our state level. And so talking to students about those, or, you know, winter counts, like my class right now, we're starting a class winter count, and how do those images like represent a moment in time? There's just like, honestly, the options are endless. Like you can do a million things. So it's really exciting. I don't know if you guys can see me very well. So I'm going to change my lighting just because it's getting darker here in Eastern Montana. So 1 second.
While you're doing that, I'll also read Amy's. Amy said you could connect this to star stories. The pictographs that are represented in our stars, and the stories, legends that come from that. So connecting all of this with star stories, that's the thing about a graphic novel like this, is that there's so much more we can connect with.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And the star stories are amazing. Because now you're tying in, you can pull in science, you know, like there's so many different things that you can tie one thing to. And so it's just really about being open-minded and being able to see like big picture, how can I take this one thing and teach tons of stuff? And then my brain usually goes overload and I overload my lesson plans. Okay, so I want you to be thinking about the types of literature that you are already introducing your students to. Think about, is this diverse? Is it representative of the population you have in your classroom? Is it representative of our state population, of our nation's population? And is it allowing for deep connections to be made? And maybe in the chat, you could tell us what grade you're teaching, and then what style of trying to figure out how to question this. So I had always taught with the basal program, and now we're in chapter books in the new district that I'm in. So thinking about, are you in a basal program where you feel stuck and structured, or do you have a little more flexibility and freedom? And you can share out verbally too. You don't have to put in the chat.
Hey, this is Amy Williams. I am currently the director for our Indigenous Immersion program at Folsom High School. So it's a new program that we're developing, which is amazing because that gives us great freedom to develop and design things that are going to hit the needs of our students. We're technically listed as a dropout prevention program, but everything that we do is seasonally based. Everything that we do is culturally based. So I have amazing freedom to develop and design programs. I have not actually read Thunderous yet, but I've known Mandy for years, and I tried getting the book from our libraries and other places to be ready for today. But anyway, so it's like, oh, I appreciate this, and I'm enjoying this. One of the things that I'm doing with literature right now in my classroom is we're doing the Braiding Sweetgrass for Youth. And
it's so good.
yeah, it is amazing. And I've loved the adult version for a long, long time. And I'm excited to have the youth version because it breaks it down in such a different way. But there's graphics in that as well. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Rebecca Roanhorse. She has a graphic novel. And then Rick Riordan has a number of authors that he is, I don't know if sponsoring would be the right word, or working with, but really promoting. And it's part of Rick Riordan Presents. And a number of the new authors that he's working with are from a lot of tribal cultures, whether it's in United States or Mexico area, Central America, but they bring in a lot of the hero stories and the cultural connections to these stories. And I could see those being tied into, from what I do know about the descriptions of Thunderous, and just bringing everyday kids, bringing all of that into it and tying it into a long unit of that. And it's so endless. Like, you're right. Our teacher brains, like, oh, I could do this, I could do that, I could do this, and bringing all those things into it. But literature right now for me is also our nature journals. So we've got nature journaling that I do with students for reflections, and they do the think, wonder, reminds me of, connects me to, and then the words, numbers, pictures, and they're reflecting pictorially, but also with little descriptions in there. And that's literature. That's them not only creating their connections, but that's them expressing it in a way that's meaningful for them. It might not be a full-blown paragraph. It might not be a sentence that's complete, but it's stating those things, which graphic novels is just that as well. It's little snippets of expression. So it's amazing. I'm a huge fan.
I'm a huge fan of what you're doing. That sounds awesome. Thanks for sharing. And I'll have to go look up. Can you type the name of Rick? Can you type his name in the chat so we can access that later? Because that sounds really cool too.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So in the chat,
Well, go ahead. Yep, go ahead. You're okay.
so in the chat, Christopher said flexibility is encouraged at the high school level, which is awesome. And then Caitlin says 6th grade English. She feels lucky to have JC Jeffers as her IEFA lead in the middle school. And so of course I had to comment and said I get to have her as a sister. So I get to go, yay. But she's a great coach there. So having those connections and representatives help us through this is always great too.
Yeah, that's awesome. So one of the reasons I just ask is because I know that in some schools we are kind of like, this is our scripted program. This is what we're teaching. And so by the end of this, I'm hoping that you can find ways to pull these types of stories in to meet the needs of all of your students. But also to kind of get you thinking about, what do I have in my classroom? What are my students accessing? And am I representing, every kid in my classroom, every kid within my community, and even at the state level? Because I know that we just have some disparities and discrepancies as we move across the state. And I think it's just important to be able to highlight those cultures and make sure that as we're a growing and changing population, we're trying to be inclusive of all of those backgrounds. So one of the things that I do next is, so we go over the graphic novel. We talk about the pieces, word blurbs, and the use of color and all those things. But we also dive into the images, and we talk about how those images work within our brain and how they work with the words. So we talk about the different symbols. We talk about the archetypes. So, like in most stories, somebody's going to be the caregiver. There's going to be stories where somebody might be the hero, or we might have a villain. And we might not come out right and say that this person's a villain, but we understand it based on the author's word choice. We do talk heavily on colors. The cool thing about Thunderous is it's very colorful, which right away was very exciting for my students. So if you don't have the book, I'll just show you a couple pages. And there's great differentiation between the mood and the tone of the story as it goes throughout. So I feel like Dale DeForest did a very great job bringing to, just making these visuals for Mandy and Natalie's ideas. I think he did a really stunning job with them. But then it's kind of fun to look at colors and the meanings for tribes, because tribes have colors, just color affiliations with different things and seasons, and talking about how, we have the sunrise and what it looks like throughout the day, and then darkness. And so we did so many investigatory things just with color. So I would encourage you to do something like that within your class. I do want to say, because I should have said this at the beginning, I am just like the teacher who's willing to jump in and dive in. And I know that's not everybody. And I know sometimes we can get hung up on not knowing all the things. And I want to just encourage you to know that that's okay. Like we don't have to know all the things in the classroom, especially when it comes to different cultures. But in doing that front loading and doing the work that you can to put yourself out there and doing some research, reaching out to different people like Mike Jetty, I actually, before I presented this at OPI, I got a hold of Mandy Smoker and was like, I want your opinion on these activities. I don't want anything to be disrespectful. I want to make sure that I'm doing you justice with the lessons that I'm creating for your book. And so I feel like if you're willing to put yourself out there, people are going to be willing to help you. So I don't want anybody to be like intimidated by all these things, but also know I learn things the hard way sometimes myself.
We also
So we
have a
talk
message
about
in the chat. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
I got one
Okay.
in the chat from Christopher. The more I can innovate, expand, and expose new dynamics of teaching into the classroom allows students to explore their creative strengths. For me, moving away from teacher-driven assignments and making projects student-driven by leaving the art open-ended, just structuring the assignment around the book. I love that.
That's a good, those are best teaching practices. Put the learning in your kids' hands. So we do all that front loading, and then I think it's important before we actually read to understand certain aspects of this book. So there are 3 Lakota values that Mandy talks about coming out strong in the book. I honestly felt like you could almost hit every one of these 7 Lakota values, and especially if you thought deeply about them. So we talk about the values in my class. I just went to a website, which I have at the end, and I created a student version of those 7 values and had things broken up for my students. And we read them in a jigsaw. So if you don't know what that is, like one group would read about fortitude, another group would read about generosity. And then after everybody's read, they kind of share out, those important pieces. And that's just to kind of alleviate some of the reading because it can get kind of heavy. But I want them to understand that going into the book, this story is tied to cultural values, and I want them to understand what the values are and how those values shape the culture. So we talked about the Lakota values, and then after that, I wasn't sure how fast my kids could read through this. As a 7th grader, that you could blow through this in 15 minutes if you didn't stop your students, which you can do that. I, as a first-time presenter of the lesson, had my group, we went through the first 10 pages. So we chunked the book up into more manageable pieces so that we could stop and talk a lot. And in the first 10 pages, I was very intentional about having them think about what the graphics were telling them. So on our first page, I can't see my screen, so if I'm too close, somebody tell me. We notice the images. We think about the significance of the images. And as we move from some of the dream, like, I think this was a dream. Sorry, I should have double checked that. As we move between different layers of what she's experiencing, we talk about that also. So in this one, she's actually interacting with Unsi, and we just talk about what is the body language saying in these images. Have you ever seen somebody react to you this way? What's making that person react this way? Because I think as a culture or a society, I should say, we've kind of moved away from reading body language because we always have a device in front of us. And so it makes students hyper aware of themselves. And so they get to say, oh my gosh, that's why my mom responds to me this way, or this is why my dad is, because they are starting to make those connections in the second page of the book, which is really exciting for them. But we also talk about how do these images help us understand the storyline? Because sometimes if you're not paying attention to a graphic novel, it's very easy to kind of get lost. So we talk about that a lot. And then we dive in to start to characterize the different main characters. So we have Ayana. She is our main character, female lead. She's very unsure of herself because she's in that like teenage era of life. She's just like any teen. She wants to fit in. She's new in her place. And she's in a place where I feel like her traditional values are starting to be challenged by societal views. And so it's kind of exciting because you can have a conversation with your kids about that too. I know we have a counselor watching. This is a great book to talk about those things. Like teens from all cultures and backgrounds go through these, what we could call growing pains, and like trying to figure out who you are. And so I felt like Ayana was a really good representation for that.
Our school counselor did
Then-
respond in there, April, and she said that she loves the values because they're great lessons for school counselors.
Yeah. I was thinking about the values also. I feel like a lot of the values are cross-cultural values in all reality. There's a lot of cultures that use these values in their own ways. But I was thinking about the, like, even fortitude. Like how many times as teachers we say we have to have a growth mindset, where we could say we're working on building our fortitude and being able to do things that are difficult. And I think just changing the language a tiny bit could make like big differences in a classroom. So I think about it from, like I said, a massive perspective, and I try to bring it down. But just those are some things that pop in my head too. So our next character is Cola. He's pretty laid back. He's fun. He kind of wants Ayana's attention in like the way that he's family, and he can see that, you know, she's seeking these other types of attention from peers and things like that. But he's encouraging to her, and he's content with what he has. And so they're kind of like a push and pull type of relationship is what I would say, in the way that he's trying to help her be more grounded and see that there's value in tradition. And she's like, oh, but I want to hang out with my friends and I want to use my cell phone, and I'm not necessarily feeling those types of things. So it's kind of interesting to compare and contrast them as characters. Then we have Unsee, and she's, you know, in all the sense of being a grandma wise and more traditional. She's the caregiver. And I think when you go through the story, you can really tell she really genuinely wants to connect with Ayana. But Ayana's a teenager. And so there's just always that disconnect between generations at certain points of growth. And so I think those are interesting conversations to have with your students as well. And then you kind of start to meet some of the different animal characters in the story. And so before I move on with that, we talk a lot about where do these characters fall within the Lakota values. So we've read a couple, you know, like 10 to 20 pages talking about which characters are embodying those values. We talk about what values would you most likely embody at this present time in your life or within your own family systems. And then we make a big chart of characters, because everybody could have, like, you can have different ideas too, because you might be reading the story differently and connecting a little bit different than your peers. So they get to place the characters on the chart, but then they get to start to make like a timeline, because the characters are going to change over time. They can move their characters around as things are changing throughout the story. Okay. What I would have done, I usually do this presentation in person. So what I would have done if we were in person, I would have had you guys break out, go through some different activities and think about what you could add to the activities, what you might change for your grade level, or if you had something, you know, in mind that could be similar. So at the end, this question I would like us to kind of come back to and just visit on. So one of the activities I do is that matching the characters to their values, and then thinking about how they're changing throughout time. Another activity I do is the connecting. Can you connect the characters to other people in your life? Like, so do you have a cola in your life? Do you have somebody who helps you realize the big picture, helps you stay grounded, encourages you, is kind of like that best friend? You know, can I connect this text to other texts? There is, and I don't have it with me, there is also and maybe Mike will know, there is another, they're comics, and it's, I want to say it's from South Dakota as well. There's an
You are
author out of Dakota,
correct.
I want to say,
You're correct.
and he has
I
like, they're like
don't,
paper comics.
I don't know the name off the top of my head, but we're looking at him to come in either best practice or next year. But he is a 5th grade teacher that has comic books. It's Coda.
Coda, yes.
Coda, the superhero. I can't remember. But I will find it and get it into the chat.
Okay, and they're great, and he's a phenomenal presenter. Like, he does a really great job of bringing his comics into a place where you can connect with your students as well. So just making the connection pieces. I mean, as a language arts or reading teacher, these are things that you probably are doing with a lot of the stories already. And so part of this is hoping that you see, like, you can easily do this with a book that highlights the cultural perspectives of a lot of the people within our state or close neighboring states. So then if you scan this QR code, I send my kids on, my 7th graders, on a seek and find. And so they had to go and they had to read deeper about the values. And so then they'd go back into the book, and where are you finding kinship happening in the story? Where are we finding compassion? And then they talk about that with their peers, and they have deep discussion, and they're allowed, you know, like, I agree with you, I disagree with you, and this is why. And they can pull in the visual pieces of that to help cite their evidence. But it's a very intentional and like heavy lesson. And so I should say this takes me multiple days. Like, it's not all obviously in one day. But now I have them doing research, and I have them citing evidence, and I have them drawing conclusions. And so you're hitting almost every, I would say you're hitting probably almost every standard, depending on your grade level. And you're also tying in the Indian Ed for All standards. And that's also super important to try and hit within different contents of our day. So I give them this QR code. It should take you to probably it's just a Lakota value. It's the website of the Lakota website based in a cultural center. So this is where I got a lot of my information about the values to share with my students. One of the other activities I have them do, and this was a major hit in my class, is they had to, once we've read the whole story, they had to go and create a playlist or a soundtrack for the novel. And so, like, it was a scene by scene playlist, and every playlist was so different. But I could totally, as I was listening to the playlist or reading through them, I could see how they could connect that song to the scene in the book. And so they were really good. And that was a great way to tie it into music class. You know, if you're a music teacher, I think sometimes we're always like pulling at threads to make things work within our classroom. But this was a really fun one, and they really enjoyed this. I had them doing a digging for inference assignment. So what they had to do is they had to go and pick out 3 images from the book. It could be any part of the book. I didn't make specifics on that. And then thinking about when we look at the image and how it's created, like, you can talk about what it reminds you of, like all those connection pieces, but what inference can you draw from this? Like, what is their face telling you? What are the colors doing for you as you start to think of the mood and the tone? And so they got to pick, a lot of them picked like beginning, middle, and end, which is fine. But it's really funny too, because if you take the words away, like if you read the book and then you just kind of take the words away as you helping them pick, then they really have to draw those inferences, because they're not necessarily going to remember the whole entire storyline. So we did a digging for inferences. Went backwards. And then a couple other things that I thought would be kind of fun is to have them create a game board where they're traveling through the novel, and they have to like have specific things within there, right? Like you have to talk about the values. Like, oh, you showed, like you hit the kinship spot and then you're jumping ahead 3 or whatever. Like creating a game board for it would be kind of fun. I also know that my students are super into the water bottle stickers. I'm sure lots of your students are as well. But one activity that I wanted to do and didn't get to was having them create water bottle stickers for each character and what their collection would look like at the end of the novel for the different things that they learn or how they change as characters, or just their perspective. And there's some really cool things you can do with that. I have my master's in learning and technology. And so Canva, you can go and create them digitally and then you can turn them into actual stickers. So that was kind of a fun thought, but we ran out of time last year. Okay, before we move on, does anybody have questions about these just small activities I would have done with my class or thoughts on them that they want to share?
You have me completely writing down all this stuff.
Oh, good.
Like, playlists, stickers. I haven't been in an elementary school in 15 years. This is pretty cool. But
anything
I mean,
to
your
make it fun
ideas
for
can
them.
work. Your ideas can work all the way through high school. I mean, who thinks
Yeah.
that doing water bottle stickers? Your mind just works awesome. I love it. Anybody else?
To be fair, I think I stole the water bottle stickers from another teacher, so I got to give credit where credit is due.
I forgot to ask you before we got all into this, April, are you willing to share your slides with us for the teachers in this session?
Yep. And Mike's been like hitting me up for my lesson plans, so I probably should actually make them look like real lesson plans. Like this is what my lesson plans look like right now, just because that's how I roll. But
Did he send you the template? We do have a template if you want to fill it out that way. It's easier.
Okay. Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
So the whole time we're reading the book, we're stopping, we're talking a lot. I have students do character analysis and diary entries for the daily reading. So taking on, like if you were Ayana, what are some thoughts that you're having that we're not hearing in the book? Just to get them to be thinking about the characters on a different level, but deeper level. We think about lots of literary elements, like the book is full of them. And I am always reviewing the Lakota values because that becomes a major part of their test that I have them do at the end. We do a lot of would you have responded this way? Because Ayana's she's gonna respond in certain ways, Cola's gonna respond. And so like, what would you have done if you were in this position? And that's usually just conversation based. I tried to like vary the different ways of instruction and response that we're doing, just because nobody wants to sit down and do 8 worksheets. We do a mind map, and I had that. We have a work in progress mind map, which helps us tie back to like where are we seeing this in the story. So I just have this mind map made of the different values, and kids are constantly adding to it, either character things or plot line items, things that stand out to them about the respect and how the interactions are happening. So I just made that as like a template for them to be filling in. Just making sure I kind of cover everything. So then we get into tricksters, which is really fun. And we get to learn more about, sorry, I'm out of order on my, I don't have it in here. Okay, so we talk about the different tricksters and the different animals or spirit animals, whatever the proper references for that. And we talk about Iktomi the trickster. And a lot of kids by 5th grade have read Raven, which is the Pacific Northwest trickster, I want to say off the top of my head. And so we get to talk about the difference and variety of tricksters. Some of them, I'm sure Mandy will talk about this. Some of them are there to teach you a lesson, and some of them are to help like pull you in a certain way or are embodying the actual word trickster and trying to trick you. And I think that varies culture to culture. Mike might have more information on that. I haven't done a ton of research into it, but it is fun to talk about tricksters. And we talk about, there's a few traditional stories of, like how Porcupine got his quills. The students always get to a point in the book where they are finishing on their own. At least my 7th graders did. I think if I brought this to 2nd grade, I would probably read it out loud. And we just constantly talking about how the characters are changing over time. And there's a lot of other things you could do. Like you could read Raven if your kids hadn't read it. You could then compare and contrast those two tricksters and then just the differences of the cultural things that are coming up in each story. I then took this and I kind of expanded out because I needed it to be more of a unit and I needed it to lead into other things. So my 7th grade English class was a Montana history based course because they were also learning Montana history at the same time in social studies or history class. And so we then hopped into Native 360, which is a website, and they have a lot of really great resources. And what I did is I tied it to, they have a whole unit on belonging. And so then I'm tying it back into my poem of, belonging and place and feeling like you're part of like a kinship and network and like ties to land, community, and nation. And so we use that whole lesson, which is really cool. They have videos. It has like tasks where you're manipulating cards on the screen. There's worksheets. So there's a very big variety of things that you can use in your classroom and kind of pick and choose what will work best in your space. But then they're starting to get to take, it's not just Lakota. They're starting to learn, Crow, Northern Cheyenne, some affiliated tribes and how they look at the land and how they look at community and their value systems and what belonging means to them. So now I'm going from just this one specific tribe, and we're branching into more tribes, which starts to develop questions, further questions for them to have, as well as things for them to think about and consider. And we're constantly referencing back to Thunderous. Where did we see this in Thunderous? What character could have been embodying this? Like, what could we have called the situation they were involved in now that we know more about the type of interactions with other tribes? And so it just becomes like this massive, phenomenal, like learning experience. And I think at the end of it, my kids really loved it, mostly because then we jumped into, I thought it was interesting. We jumped into becoming a Crow chief. So we went from a graphic novel to more of a memoir. And so it just allowed them to understand, like, culturally, we still have this living, breathing identity within our state. And it has they have so many past ties, and they have ties to the whole space we all live in. And so I feel like the way it was presented to all the students, it just made a lot of sense to them. And it wasn't like we weren't working from history forward, which I feel like tends to be the narrative. Like we start in the past and we come to where we are now. And I think sometimes it's nice to flip that script and give kids a different perspective. So I talk fast and I talk a lot. Are there questions?
There's a couple of them in the not questions, but a couple comments in the chat. Chrissy Parker says a mood board for each character would be really cool.
Yes. Ooh,
and then of course, Chris is taking notes just like me. Caitlin said, I thought it would be cool to look at how Mandy wrote and worked with the illustrator and have students practice. One student writes and the other student tries to illustrate.
Yes, because so Mandy, I got this off of one of her interviews. And I don't know if this is true today, but they had not met Dale DeForest. And from the interview I heard, like, everything everything was like, just oral. I don't even know if they did Zoom, to be honest. That'll have to be a question for her next week if she ever
Yeah.
Zoomed with him. I know, I'm like, well, I wish we could have just joined together for this, because that would have been interesting. But because then that also puts them in a similar role, right? Like, you have to listen to what I have to say and try and draw that for me. I like that idea. That's a good one.
I've got, this is really wonderful. I work with students on very different timelines. So might just be working with 1 or 2 students at any given time on this book. I'd love to be able to take some of the assignments and adjust for our environment. Then they can share their learning with students who get there after they do. That's really cool.
Yeah, I think it's super easy. The readability is decent. I know that there was also, from the interview, there was a request. I'm just trying to cite all my sources. There was a request to get this on, I want to say like an audio version, so that if you have students who do struggle with reading, they can still follow the plot line or hear it. Or maybe it was also like a visual version. So I know that some of those things might be in the works or maybe already out there. So depending on your students' needs and ability to access different types of media, that could be good for them. I know that there is going to be a speaker talking about creating lesson plans, so I don't want to like overstep, but I did want to kind of circle back to like, how could you use this in your classroom, especially if you're in like a strict, like, this is what we do. So you could use it as a read aloud. I think that's always a really great option. And it doesn't have to be like a teacher-led read aloud. It could be a whole class. We're all following along and reading aloud together. And you can vary that depending on what your students' needs are. So when I moved into my new district, we had just adopted a brand new curriculum. And because I had done a Montana history unit, I know that the 5th grade teachers were like, where are we going to plug in Indian Ed for All story? And so they had sat through my Thunderous presentation, but I'd also suggested a few other books to them. And I think if you are hitting all the standards that the book that you're supposed to be using per se, and swapping in a new book and still hitting the standards, for speaking, listening, and reading literature, I don't think you're going to have any hiccups, because you're still teaching those standards that the kids have to know. And I think a lot of schools would be open to that if it's an Indian Ed for All novel and ties to Montana standards. So just be thinking creatively about it, because I think there's a lot of ways you could do it. So I don't want people to feel like they've been like put into this box of what they can and can't bring into their classroom. This is how I come up with all of my lessons. Not always in this order, because sometimes I start with research, but obviously I want everything to tie to my standards. If I can tie it to my standards, I can teach it. I've created lots of lessons that many people would never even think could be a lesson, like referencing back to the Montana History Conference. But I think when you know your kids and you can build lessons for them, it makes their learning that much more engaging and that more meaningful for them. So standards, I research, I try to bring everything together as best I can. Sometimes, obviously, there's hiccups, and then that's when I'm in my trial and error phase. So I might try out my lesson for 1 year, take a break for a year, and then come back to it knowing more. I think that's the best part about being a teacher, is modeling that learning and the willingness to keep discovering things for your students. And it really helps you grow as a teacher as well. This has nothing to do with Thunderous, but one of my biggest lessons I ever made became a massive unit, and it was all based on homesteading, and it had irrigation specialists, and I had beet dump specialists, and I like I had people like in this massive bubble, and we were talking about, you know, the impact and implication on tribes, and we were talking about how this impacted, you know, the environment, and it was massive. And I started massive, and it all came together. That doesn't always happen for everybody, but I do want to encourage teachers to like kind of push yourself, test the waters, and if you're bringing it in reverse, like trial and error down to standards, and it works, it works. But if you start at standards, it usually flows better that way. And so that's kind of how I come up with my lessons. I just get excited about something. This book was exciting for me because my 5th grader loves graphic novels, and he had, you know, his whole life was told graphic novels, we have to read other things too. And that's true. But I think as teachers, we can model how we can have a good, healthy balance. Sorry, I feel like I just totally like, here's everything. So then these are some things that I did next, or thought you could do next. I did do a couple of them. So I did the Native 360 belonging lesson. I thought you could do a student created collaboration comic where you do research, and this would definitely be an older class. So middle school, maybe even high school, where you do the research on a tribe and figure out, you know, colors and how the colors work within their tribal systems. And maybe hear some of their oral stories or traditional stories and create a comic for a tribe. Or bring in people from, if you are near a reservation, bring people in to help you create those. I thought that would be super awesome. Maybe this is something you front load for an Indian Ed for All unit, or it's at the end of an Indian Ed for All unit, and it's a more fun, relaxed way to end the unit. I thought you could create an audio version where you're narrating it as if you're, you know, telling it with the characters' voices that you imagine in your head, and then plug in that playlist. Or if you're doing, I know there's a lot of really cool apps where you can draw lines on character faces and then they're moving. I think it's called Poplet is the one I used when I taught 2nd grade. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do with technology. Or you could have your students create their own children's book. And maybe they do family and historical research of their own and create, you know, a value-based book on what their culture admires and looks for or strives to attain. But I also thought it would be really cool because there's a lot of language revitalization going on to springboard this, if you're a high school teacher, into a unit on language revitalization, and working with reservations that are practicing that right now and encouraging that, and see like what type of things you could create with them.
I'm gonna ask Matt if he is available, what he thinks of that. Matt Bell is on here today. He's our language specialist. So he works with class 7 teachers. He's probably just getting the information and soaking it all in like the rest of us.
It's a lot. I'm sorry. I didn't think I could fill 2 hours, but I can apparently talk a long time if I really need to.
Yeah, that'd be a great idea. There's lots of Lakota language resources out there and more coming, and then other languages, of course, have other resources. Yeah, great idea.
I
So
think the back of the book too, for the ones that don't have the book.
Oh,
I don't know if you could see it, but that last page, yeah, you can see it better on yours, April. That last page has some of the native language and the translation,
yeah.
little glossary there too, so that helps.
Yeah, I think this was super fun too, because then my kids were running around calling, you know, a porcupine and a prairie dog by their native language for quite a while, and I thought that was kind of fun. But then also talking about how, like, where's that translation coming into play with our, you know, with the English language. So there's so many like different avenues you can go depending on your comfortability with what you're teaching. And that's something I like to be upfront about, is like, I'm gonna make mistakes. I don't ever try to misrepresent anything, and I'm a human, so um, letting kids kind of like learn to play with what they're learning and the environment around them so that they have a better understanding, I think is super important. There are a lot of videos and articles that are more aimed for probably, I would say, high school or college level with the language revitalization. But I know as I move across the state, I see lots of different signage and representation of language. So that's kind of fun. And you could take kids on like a virtual field trip of those. That could be kind of cool to see like what's happening in our state to bring these languages back. And it's why it's so important, the work that's being done.
That's funny that you mentioned that, because right as you were saying that, Amy Williams was putting in the chat. I would think reaching out to our tribal colleges would be a good connection for teachers for tribal language links and resources. So you guys both mentioned colleges right at the same time. The other thing is that Matt Bell has on the OPI student achievement, IEFA student achievement tab. There you can click on the language, and there are I don't know how many now, but a ton of apps from the different tribes around the state and a few outside of the state. So he's got some great resources on our website too. But if you find others, please email us, because we always like to add.
Yeah. And I think it's important for them to hear, because I have been teaching for a long time, but I'm still going to mispronounce things, especially words with different languages. And I think it's so important for kids to try and put in an honest effort to say it properly. And so having an app that can read it to you is super nice. Let me see. I wanted to see before we move on if anybody had any pressing, like, oh my gosh, I came up with this awesome idea while listening, because I like to take other people's ideas as well. I know I'm not doing everything, in every avenue of teaching the 100% perfect. So I like to grow. So if you came up with anything and you haven't shared it yet, because I know some people have, I'd love to hear it.
And while people are kind of thinking or putting that into the chat, I just want to remind everybody that this year we do need to sign into the sign-in sheet for renewal. So if you need renewal, please look in the chat. Joan has linked the renewal, because it looks like I only have 6 out of 7 that are in there.
And then these would be my resources. Basically anything that I pulled for my students, I would have pulled it from these different areas, as well as I just got a hold of Mandy and was like, hey, can we talk? So that was really nice of her to take time out of her day to help me with that. Mike Jetty also made this is funny. Mike Jetty made a lesson on Thunderous, and I had no idea, or I would have just used his, to be honest. And it's kind of funny. We had a lot of crossover links after I found out, because he was like, would you mind sharing yours with me? And I made a lesson too. I'm like, no way. And I went and looked at it. I'm like, oh my gosh, we used a lot of the same resources, which is kind of funny. But he has quite a few more, like he has more resources. And so I would encourage everyone to kind of go look at the OPI website for his lesson plan. I just got to share with you how I used it in my classroom. And I'm sure you guys are all going to come up with amazing things for your own classrooms.
So Chrissy put in the chat, breakdown of words using illustrations. Lakota and Dakota language is very descriptive, bringing more language into the read aloud, such as learning color names before reading, then recalling as you're reading by pointing out the color and prompting students to use Lakota vocab. I really like this, because what the first thing I think of when you say color is our art teacher that's in here is, that's a good way to bring the language into like an art classroom. Into any classroom, but the art classroom, because I think art sometimes is the hardest. Art and music are sometimes the hardest to bring stuff into.
Yeah, anytime I present, I try to have an art or music tag because it never fails. There's always an art or music teacher in the room. So I always wanted to make it relevant for anybody. But yeah, I like adding more language. I think that's a really good idea. Yeah, I want to say thank you for coming. I know it's hard. It's a 2-hour session at the end of a workday, but I do appreciate teachers being willing to learn and get excited about using lessons in their classroom that I created, or anybody could have created these. So it's exciting to see like the spark from teachers, and I enjoy it a lot. So I'm glad people could show up.